growth in the human capital stock as measured by completed schooling was unrelenting until about 1970 or so. Right? So something happened around that time that got the United States off track from this steady increase. And it's not as though we're reaching some natural limit on the amount of education that our population receives. The United States was long first in terms of high school graduation rates. It's now fallen from first to 19th among OECD countries. It's fallen from first to 12th in terms of college graduation rates. This shocking statistic came out. The United States is the only country where soon-to-retire workers have completed more education than new workers. So part of this is immigration, but a lot of it is related to this falling out of education that we saw in that earlier graph. So the United States, which long had this leadership position, has really fallen well behind the pack in terms of how much education we're providing. This has implications not only for how prosperous our country is going to be in 20 or 30 years, but it also has implications for the kind of values that I think Americans hold most dear. And that is that America is a very dynamic place where if you apply yourself, you can do better than your parents did, and your kids are going to be able to do better than you did. If you look at data going back to 1930, these are dates when people have turned 25, and these are national data. So to what extent are adults gaining more education than their parents? And if you compare men with their fathers, what you see over what being a lot of the 20th century, first half especially, was that males were progressively outdoing their fathers in terms of completed schooling. If you did this with women and their daughters and their mothers, you get the same kind of pattern. But that peaked right around 1970 or so. And since then, the extent to which sons are gaining on education relative to their fathers started to fall. If you do the obverse of this and look at the extent to which sons are getting less education than their fathers, that's been increasing steadily over the last 20 or 30 years. Right? So both what this is likely to entail for how productive our economy is going to be, as well as the extent to which we can make good on our commitment to have each succeeding generation on average do better than the prior generation, has really become at risk, and it's important to understand why. So, what's going on? And what I want to talk about today is how important the widening gap in terms of achievement and attainment between high and low income children, how important that's been, the growing gap in accounting for this slowdown in education progress. It comes from a book that I co-edited with Dick Murnane that came out in 2011. We're in the death throes of doing a second book that is half a more accessible summary of the first book and half it's a case study of successful interventions in education and families that we think are good ways to proceed in terms of policy. This book, normally authors are here to promote their books. This has 27 chapters and it's about 500 pages thick. So if you're, in terms of how academics write chapters, this is not bad. We have all our authors, almost all the authors. If you're ever an editor of a book, you can get some of the authors to do exactly what you want, and some people just don't. Most of them did what we suggested, and that was put tables and figures, simple tables and figures into the book and put all the complicated stuff into an online appendix. So the chapters are fairly accessible, but they cover a wide range of topics related to this increasing income inequality and links to kids' attainments. But in January, February, we'll come out with the second book, 150 pages. Reads like a novel. We're sending it off to the printer at the end of this month, so it's very much on my mind. So anyway, the chapters in this book came from a couple of conferences that Russell Sage Foundation and the Spencer Foundation co-funded, and all the chapters are trying to understand what's gone on in the last 20 or 30 years to account for why there's this increasing gap between high and low income kids in terms of their school accomplishments. Here's a simple way of seeing what's happened between low and high income kids. This is a chapter by Martha Bailey and Sue Dynarski, where they took national data on kids who turned 14 back in the mid-1970s, kids who turned 14 in the mid-1990s, and tracked them for 10 years and tried to measure how much education they attained. In particular, in this graph, it's showing college graduation rates. So kids turning 14, you can measure their incomes. 10 years later, how many of them have graduated from college? Right, very simple kind of comparison. So if you look off to the left, kids who turned 14 in the mid-1970s and whose family income was in the bottom 25% of the income distribution. That's a cutoff of about $35,000 or so family income. 5% of them ended up graduating from college. Right? Roll the clock forward. Now look at kids who turned 14 in the mid-1990s. That's gone up. Kids whose family incomes were in the bottom quartile have higher graduation rates, but it's only 9% compared to 5%. So it's an increase, but the 9% is still a very, very low rate of college graduation. If you go up to the top of the income distribution, to the top 25%, so I'm not talking about the 1%, I'm talking about the 20 or so million kids who were in families with incomes in the top 25%. Back in the mid-1970s, about a third of them, 36%, had graduated college. By mid-1990s, that figure had increased a lot to 54%. So the gap in terms of completed schooling between low-income kids and high-income kids increased very dramatically over this period from the roughly late 70s to now. If you back it up, you can say, well, maybe a lot of that's the increase in college tuition and the affordability problems that low-income families have. If you back it up and look at test scores, when kids are still in K-12 schooling, one of the chapters in the book is this monumental analysis of all the surveys that have followed kids and tested those kids to try to see what their math achievement is, reading achievement. And quite a few of these surveys also have gathered information about family income. So you can see to what extent high and low income kids are scoring differentially in terms of math scores and reading scores across time. Right? So again, we're indexing time by the age at which the kids turn 14. Most of these kids are tested around middle school, early high school. Sean Reardon, who's the author, took all the available tests that he could. But back in the late 60s, early 70s, if you compared kids who, in this case, were at the 90th percentile versus the 10th percentile in terms of family income, the high-income kids, of course, outscored the low-income kids, and the difference was on the order of about 0.8 of a standard deviation. And that's about 80 points on an SAT test. 80 points is about 3 times as much as a child will learn in 7th or 8th grade in math or reading. Right? So it's a 3-year difference essentially in terms of achievement in the middle grades, and that's the difference between high and low income kids back in the 70s. Right? Roll the motion picture forward. to just a few years ago, the latest measurements, and that gap between high and low income kids has grown from about 0.8 of a standard deviation to almost 1.25 standard deviations. All right, so the gap between high and low income kids has increased by about a grade level of learning. Right, the gap is increased by that amount. So this picture of test score changes is reinforcing the picture of attainment changes in the previous graph. Not only has the amount of schooling that kids completed diverged significantly by income, but test scores have as well. It's a quite dramatic phenomenon. And this was puzzling for a lot of us because we're much more familiar with the black-white differences in test scores. That's something that the National Assessment of Education Progress, which is a big national survey periodically, has tracked for years. And that's been a very encouraging kind of time frame. That what used to be very, very large gaps back around 1970, there were almost 1.25 standard deviations between the white advantage over black students. And that fell substantially in the 1970s and early 80s. Blacks made a lot of progress, schools were desegregating. The quality of schools that blacks attended by and large was increasing. Things stalled out by the 1990s, but if you take a broad look over this entire period, you see a lot of progress for blacks relative to whites. Still a gap, I don't want to minimize that, but at least it's a smaller gap than used to be the case back around 1970. But race and class, as is obvious here, are not the same thing. At the same time that you had quite substantial improvements in the achievement gaps, this is reading, but there are similar kinds of trends for math. At the same time that you have these favorable trends in terms of gaps by race, you have things going in exactly the opposite direction by income. By income. So race is narrowing, income is increasing. Right? So what's going on? What would it be about what's happened in the last 30 or 40 years that might account for this increasing gap between high and low income kids in terms of their achievement and in terms of their attainment? That was really the focus of the book. So, what's going on? Part of what's gone on is that income inequality has increased so much over the last 3 or 4 years. Right? I'm sure you've heard about this. I think a lot of the discussion in the past couple of years has been focused on the top 1%. But I'm not talking about the top 1%. I'm talking about the millions of kids in the top 20% or the top 25% versus the millions of kids in the bottom 20 or 25%. So bear with me through a couple more graphs, and I'll show you what's really happened to income inequality over the last really 50 years. So we're starting here just after World War II and running the clock 30 years ahead from 1947 to about 1977. Let's take family incomes and see what family income separates the bottom 20% from everybody else. Turns out in 1947 that was an income of about $13,000. And we're plotting the bottom 20% with that solid line. And we're seeing how much that threshold, that bottom 20% threshold, was changing over time. How much did it grow from $13,000? And if you look at the solid line, you can see by 1979, it was up to twice as what it was back in 1947. Right? So that bottom threshold cut point had gone from about $13,000 to $26,000. Incomes had doubled by and large over this period. If you do the same thing with the top 20%, that was a cut point of about $45,000. That doubled to $90,000. Right? Top 5%, they started out at about $80,000. That doubled to $160,000. So, phrase "a rising tide lifts all boats" was very popular in the 1960s to describe how economic growth might benefit everybody. This period following World War II was exactly a case of a rising tide lifting all boats. Everyone profited from the doubling of the economy over this period. Right? But that's up until the late 70s. Now we're going to roll the picture forward. We're going to reset at 1979 equals 100 to try to see what's happened. Right? So we're starting out in 70, but in 1979, that's the $26,000 and the $90,000 and the $160,000 I described. Start there, roll the picture forward and see what happens. Right? Now we're not getting anyone doubling except actually the top 1%, that's way up at the top. But the bottom 20% didn't go anywhere. You know, what was doubling after World War II wasn't going anywhere between 1979 and 2009. So in 2009, that cut point was still around $26,000. In fact, it was a little bit less. So this bottom solid line ends up a little bit below 1. In contrast, the top 20% cut point was up about 30%. The top 5% cut point was about 40%. And then, as I said, if you go way up to the top 1%, you get this more than doubling. So incomes starting in the 1970s and continuing with, well, you can see what's happened. Around, the shaded areas are recession. Right? So a lot happened right around the time Ronald Reagan took office, but it's not due to Ronald Reagan. Make clear that's true. I've lived in California for 4 years, and I know that I should speak well of Ronald Reagan. It was forces much beyond Ronald Reagan's control. There was a steep recession in the early 2000s. You know, everyone's income took a hit, especially people at the bottom, and they really never recovered very much from that. The 1990s were a time of economic growth, but for everybody. But basically, the economic growth in between the downturns never brought the bottom 20% income up to where it was in 1979. So what happened to cause income inequality to increase so much? There are a lot of explanations. Unionization decline, minimum wage decline in real terms, immigration increased, and the demand for low-skilled jobs increased as a result. But the number one factor that was driving this increase in income inequality, most economists would say, would be technological change. And we've always had technological change, sometimes as with assembly line techniques. Technological change favors low-skilled workers as much as it favors high-skilled workers. But starting in the 70s and continuing today, the technological change has been more computer-based, which tends to reward, by and large, higher-skilled workers relative to low-skilled workers. So the basic force behind a lot of the increased income inequality is this skill-biased technological change that has favored more highly educated workers. So here's a nice example of how jobs have been upgraded as a result. 1976, Department of Labor Occupational Handbook. Secretaries relieve their employees of routine duties so that they can work on more important matters. That was the definition of what a secretary was. 2001, office automation and organizational restructuring have led secretaries to assume a wide range of new responsibilities. Once reserved for managerial and professional staff, many secretaries now provide training and orientation to staff, conduct research on the internet, and learn to operate new office technology. Right, so even the occupation of secretary is now requiring many more skills than used to be the case. And that's true in many different occupations. Blue-collar occupations, working with machines, for example, on a shop floor, often requires higher skills now than used to be the case. And as these skill requirements have changed, there have been huge shifts in the occupational distribution. So blue-collar jobs back in 1979 constituted about a third of the total workforce. A third of the people back in 1979 worked in blue-collar jobs. In 2009, that had fallen 20%. Right? There were just many, many fewer traditional blue-collar jobs. Administrative support. Insurance companies used to have enormous back office filing operations because everything was on paper, and they needed a big workforce of clerks to keep it all straight. That's all been automated away. So this administrative support category declined significantly too. What's gone up? Well, professionals and managerials, but it's not simply a low skill, high skill. There are some low skill areas like service work, working in restaurants, working in nursing homes. Demand for those things have increased. Those are things that are difficult to automate. But by and large, what's grown has been occupations that have higher skill requirements, demand more education. So that's driven up wages of high-skilled workers. The differential between a college graduate in terms of earnings relative to the high school graduate grew very substantially between 1970 and now. So that wage differential growth has driven income inequality to a substantial extent. So even though this happened when Ronald Reagan first took office, it was these much larger economic-wide technological changes, globalization, that has been working relentlessly over the last 4 years or so to make it much more difficult for someone with just a high school education to get a stable middle-class job. So, what does all this have to do with kids? Right? And again, there have been a lot of books about inequality. Our book is really focused on what links exist between income inequality and how kids are doing. Their test scores, their achievement, their ultimate attainment, and ultimately how successful they're going to be as workers in the next generation. So what are the linkages? Well, this is what the 27 chapters are about. We tried to figure it all out, and that's what we came up with. I won't try to work all this through, but rather I will simplify it. How about that? So, a lot of different things going on, but simply told, income inequality off to the left has its linkages to children's achievement and attainment, in part through what happens to families in the face of income inequality, and in part what's happened to schools in the face of income inequality. Right? So there's going to be a family story that I want to describe very briefly, and then a school story. And both of those things have worked in concert to help translate this increase in income inequality to an increase in the gap in attainment and achievement between high and low income kids. So let's first talk about the family income story. So income inequality is obviously driving a wedge between the incomes of high and low income families, much larger now than it used to be. There are two principal ways in which that has affected how kids are doing. One is in terms of the obvious what money can buy. Right? Higher income families now have more money than they used to relative to low income families. And they have the potential for spending that money in ways that advantage their kids. Right? So that's part of the story. Another part of the story is that higher income enables families to manage work and family better, to maintain lower levels of stress. Parenting is better when stress levels are lower. So there's also a route that involves money, but it operates through parenting and stress. So let me talk about each of those in turn. What money can buy? We know that income inequality is driving this wedge in the income levels of high and low income families. Let's take this same top 20%, bottom 20% division of the population, and look and see how much of the income that families have at the top and bottom is actually spent on behalf of their kids. All right, so here we can look at consumer expenditure data. where we can try to see to what extent money is being used to buy high-quality childcare, family taking vacations, buying computers, buying books, buying private school, perhaps. If you look back to 1972-73, which is the first consumer expenditure survey, and tally up those expenditures for families who are in the top 20% of the income distribution, they spent about $3,500 on enrichment expenditures, this collection of things that I talked about, $3,500 a year. Low-income families, of course, spent less, about $835 on average for those kinds of things. All right, so now let's roll the tape forward and look at the top 20%, the bottom 20% in the most recent consumer expenditure survey, which took place in 2005-2006. Now the bottom 20%, their incomes have not changed very much. Their expenditures have gone up somewhat from about $835 to $1,300. But look what's happened at the top. Right? The top 20%, we're spending these are all inflation adjusted. The top 20%, we're spending $3,500 back in the early 70s. They're now spending almost $9,000 on their kids. Right? So when there's that kind of spending difference, you could imagine that this is going to lead to differences in how kids are doing on SAT tests and in school generally, and their ability to go to college and so forth. So that's the expenditure side of things. There's also, as I say, a stress and parenting part of the story. One of the pieces of evidence on both what money can buy in terms of expenditures as well as stress and parenting comes from trying to look in the 1990s when the earned income tax credit became much more generous, to try to see to what extent families in a given position before it became more generous in the early 1990s, to what extent their kids were achieving certain levels. In another study, there was monitoring of the mental health of mothers, as well as biomarkers of stress that they were showing. So if a mother's in a situation with a couple of kids before the EITC becomes more generous, someone in exactly the same position a few years later is going to have a family income several $1,000s higher because the earned income tax credit became more generous. Right? So it takes a little bit of work, but you can actually see to what extent achievement test scores seem to be different before and after that happened, and some of these indicators of stress and mental health changed. And in two different studies, what you find is evidence that indeed money coming out of the earned income tax credit, which is pretty much, the fact that it increased was pretty much beyond the control of these families. After the more generous EITC kicked in, the test scores of kids in these families were about 20 SAT points higher, both in terms of math and reading. And what's really interesting, if you look at some health surveys that the government runs, again for women who are in a situation who would stand to benefit from this more generous earned income tax credit, not only are they reporting fewer bad mental health days, the kind of subjective reports of mental health, but if you look at the biological data that were collected, this is a National Health Interview Survey, there's a biomarker for stress called C-reactive protein that's used a lot in medical literature. And if you look at what fraction of those moms are above some critical level, that's gone down as the generosity of the earned income tax credit goes up. Right? So this is the kind of evidence that you can look to try to see to what extent this family story is playing out, in which this growing income gap is translating into a growing achievement and attainment gap for kids. Right? So that's the family income story. There's also a school story. And it looks something like this. Income inequality was increasing starting late 70s, early 80s. One of the things that happened as that happened was that residential segregation by income increased as well. Right? So poor families in the early 1990s compared to 1980, poor families were more likely to be living with other poor families. Rich families were more likely to be living with other rich families. The actual numbers look like this. This is another study by Sean Reardon, who's at Stanford University. Now you first look at this thing and you think, oh boy, it's improving, and it's improving faster for low-income than high-income families. But we don't want this to improve. This is a residential isolation index. Right? It's trying to track the extent to which a low-income family is surrounded by other low-income families. And this index, a higher number indicates more isolation, a higher likelihood of living with people in your own income class. And that went up by 50% for low-income families between 1970 and 2000. And it also went up for high-income families. All right, so low-income kids were more likely to be surrounded by low-income classmates. High-income kids were more likely to be surrounded by high-income classmates. Schools are still pretty much local operations. People tend to go to their neighborhood schools. So this increasing family income inequality, which is leading to increased residential segregation by income, also seems to be leading to increased school segregation by income. And again, one of the chapters in the book describes the extent to which schools in the 1990s are more likely to be uniformly low income, uniformly high income versus schools 20 years before. Right? So as income inequality has increased, school segregation by income seems to have increased as well. And what's that going to mean? Well, if you start working from residential school segregation, you start thinking, well, what's going to happen in a low-income school if there's a much greater concentration of low-income kids in that school? One of the things that may well happen is that low-income kids are going to be more likely to be surrounded by lower achieving classmates, worse behaving classmates, more residentially mobile classmates. We've always known that residential mobility is much higher among low-income families than high-income families. And as schools become more uniformly low-income, the rates of turnover in a class across a year is likely to be higher. One of the chapters documents this in Chicago, where it's not uncommon for 5 kids in a class size of 22. You can actually have a class size of 22 somewhere outside of the state of California. 5 kids will come and go. Will enter and leave, 5 kids each over the course of a school year, which creates a lot of problems for a teacher. Integrating the new students, keeping the existing students on track. And the study showed that as a class became more dynamic in terms of changing, you had effects not only on the kids who were moving around, but you also had effects on kids who weren't moving around. They were affected adversely in terms of their test scores by residentially mobile kids coming home. So more uniformly low-income classmates, higher student turnover, and the last thing is the effects on teacher quality. Right? It's much harder to retain high-quality teachers as working conditions in low-income schools deteriorates. And one of the other likely consequences of this increase in segregation by income within schools is that it's been harder to maintain decent levels of teacher quality in these schools. So all these things are affecting school functioning and eventually affecting kids' attainments. So here's a little bit of data about achievement level differences between high-income and low-income schools to reinforce what's likely to happen as these peer compositions change. Achievement problems are much more likely, much more prevalent in low-income schools. Those are the white bars compared to high-income schools. Those are the yellow bars. Attention problems, engagement in school. If you ask teachers about how whether individual children have problems engaging in class, that's much more likely to be reported in low-income schools than high-income schools. And behavior problems, same thing. Not as big a gap as achievement problems. But all these things are reinforcing the story about as a school becomes more uniformly low-income, the peer composition is changing in adverse ways. Okay, so family income story, school story, those are reinforcing and producing this link between increasing income inequality and increasing gaps in kids' achievement and attainment. So let me make a few policy thoughts. This one always brings gasps from sociologists in the audience. Although income inequality may be the root cause, reducing it may not be the most cost-effective policy for boosting school success. Right? So if we really think an increase in income inequality has been causing a lot of this, how do we think about solving that problem? 5 minutes of noticing the political debate about income inequality, I think, can convince one that it's difficult to think that substantial changes in the tax code or other kinds of changes is likely to have much of a measurable effect on income inequality itself. Right? So even though you might advocate for that kind of position,